It was reported a couple months ago that Larry Hoover and Chief Malik were having lunch together in the cafeteria at the Supermax prison, and that they often now do this, and that these guys have become like friends in prison. Now, this is a situation where you have two guys who, 50 years ago, when they were back out on the street, would have been bitter blood rivals, right? This is something that is very common that I see, which is that when guys get past a certain age, usually it's like into their 30s, 40s, and they have kids of their own, they have families. A lot of times, beef that used to be like deadly serious, all of a sudden it's just not that serious anymore. They just see it from a different perspective. They meet up with guys that previously they would have killed if they had seen them on sight, and it's like all love. It's like, we grew up in this same environment with the same conflict, and it's like all of a sudden they're on the same page, and nothing even needs to be said. No truce needs to be written out. Nothing needs to happen like that. I've seen this time and time and time again. I know the Harrison Gents I was seeing something on Facebook. A friend of mine had sent me something where they were squashing something with some of their former rivals. And it was like nobody needed any money to be paid to do this. It was just like, this is old stuff now. Chief Keef was, checking somebody that was, smoking on Tuka, talking about that's old. Why are you saying Shorty's name? Like defending his former ops. This is how it goes when guys get older and they move out of the environment, and they kind of distance themselves from that, man. And a lot of times, they look on the guys that have died or been incarcerated for life due to what they were doing when they were younger, is like, this is super tragic, because our perspective now is totally different. And if they had just outlived that stage of their life, they might not have had to end up in that situation, man. So in this video, we're going to document gang wars, and there's many more, but I'm going to name some of the most well-known that have just ended in various ways, some by truces, some by guys getting older. Gang wars that used to be super hot, people getting killed, people getting attacked, people afraid to come outside, had the neighborhood terrorized, and now it's pretty much completely over in most of these cases. And some of this is due to certain gangs actually going extinct themselves, or joining gangs that formerly sometimes would have been into it with. So the first one that we're going to talk about was a gang conflict that was going on the north side for years, for really as far back as I knew about, and this actually ended due to a truce. You may have already seen me report on this when it happened, because it was big news on the streets. It didn't make any news as far as like the TV stations or anything like that, but in the streets, this was huge news. And there was two gangs in the Uptown area. Okay, there's Hula Gang, or Wicked City. They're Black Pea Stones over by Wilson and Magnolia. Now this is one of the gangs. This is right next to Truman College. They share a neighborhood with a gang called the Young Lords, which is the younger generation of what used to be the Gaylords. Okay, now that name Gaylords, that name was picked when gay didn't mean what it means today. Okay, I think it had something to do with the name of the street, Gillard, but at any rate, that name didn't mean that. They renamed the set, and they were clicked up with Hula Gang. They shared that neighborhood, and basically they had the same conflicts and everything as Hula Gang. So Hula Gang is Black Stones. The Black Stones over there is a prominently black gang, as the name indicates. But actually, the term black in Black Stone doesn't refer to like black people. It refers to the street name Blackstone. There was a street called Blackstone on the south side of Chicago, and that's what that refers to. But it is a predominantly black gang that was formerly headed by Chief Malik. They had held that neighborhood down for as far back as I can remember, in the Uptown neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. That's on the western side of Broadway. On the eastern side of Broadway, there's another gang of it's actually two gangs clicked up. Okay, there's a set called Lil Four Mob, which is over by Hazel and Sunnyside. That's Four Corner Hustlers. Okay, then just about a block to the north of that, there's Conservative Vice Lords, a set of them. Okay, and these two gangs ride together. A lot of times you'll see Vice Lords and Four Corner Hustlers riding together. You see like those two gangs, various factions of those gangs clicking up all over the west side, but there's also a lot of situations where they're into it. But in this particular situation, they are clicked up. So they were beefing with Hula Gang for a long time. Now, part of this was exacerbated, I would say, by the fact, if not entirely due to the fact, that Hula Gang, due to them getting closer to the GDs from Rogers Park, namely Insane Cutthroats, that's all the way from like 8-10 blocks north of that. But the Hoolies started to get along with them. Now, they previously had been beefing with those GDs. So, I mean, I could technically include that as a war that ended, but the reason I'm not doing that is because it started back up again. So, the Hula Gang Stones were getting along with the GDs from Farwell and Ashley and Rogers Park, that's PBG. Well, the Four Corner Hustlers and GDs, if you know the history of Chicago gang culture, they've never gotten along, ever. Now, today, there's some situations where you have Four Corner Hustlers and GDs clicked up, like, for example, over by Costner and Monroe in West Garfield Park, and I believe over by East End. I think that's Four Corner Hustlers and GDs. That's something you never used to see, though, in the 90s. But at any rate, this Uptown situation, there's a lot of big homies that are locked up, okay, behind all this. So the Stones and the GDs from Rogers Park started to get along and go against the Four Corner Hustlers and the Vice Lords, and this war was going on for a long time. And it was probably the biggest conflict on the north side of Chicago that I can think of outside of Cabrini Green. So I'm looking at this like, man, I had like given up hope, which I shouldn't have done. That was stupid of me to give up hope, because it was like around, I'd say 2017, the big homies in prison started to like negotiate some stuff. From what I heard, this is just what I heard. There's nothing official, but it was coming down from the guys higher up, from the older guys. And typically it is the older guys. If there is going to be a truce, it's the older guys that are going to have to do it, because the younger guys are almost never on that. Like, these young guys, they're out here invincible, high off pills. I mean, they're just not doing anything that's going to lead to peace. But the older guys in prison, they started, I guess, talking it out, and seeing all the bloodshed that was going on in Uptown. All they had to do was squash between themselves and then pass the word down to the younger guys. So they had this opportunity. They did that, and like when that word came from the prison to the street, the shorties were gonna enforce that. They did. And I had mentioned to you guys about 8 years ago, if you were on my channel in the really early days when I was first starting to talk about the north side, I was saying, like, the Four Corner Hustlers and the Vice Lords, they still have like some structure in their stuff, you know. They still got like big homies who, I'm not going to say like directly call shots for them, but they do exercise some type of influence over them. So they called a truce. I'm like, this is too good to be true. I started hitting up some guys like from the neighborhood, and they're like, yeah, it's true. Now, they weren't all like, oh, let's go over there and kick it with them and party, because these are guys that were just like firing shots at each other, you know what I'm saying? It was just kind of a situation like, you see us, we're going to give you a pass, and, you know, if we're coming through your hood or whatever, you give us a pass. But try to stay out of each other's lanes, stay out of each other's way. So it wasn't like guys were partying together and kicking it and being cool and everything, but they started giving each other a pass. And as far as I've heard, it's held. That truce is held. And that was one of the worst conflicts on the north side, and it actually stopped through the big homies calling it off. So that's probably the top one I can think of just as a north sider. Now, there's another one that I could rank as second, actually that I could rank as first in this, but that I don't have enough details on as to exactly what happened and why it stopped. And that was, so I'm just going to slip this one in here real quick. I had covered a conflict over on the west side of Chicago in the Lawndale neighborhood that was going on for a while. And this was between two sets. One was by 16th and Avers, called Avers Money Gang, AMG. and another set called Millard Mob over by 13th and Millard. Now, this was a gang that to which belonged one of the kids that was covered in a documentary called Last Chance High. And by the way, one of the kids from that documentary, well, he wasn't a kid anymore, just recently got killed. I'm going to put his picture up here, Keontae. Rest in peace to Keontae. I was seeing some of the stuff that was said about him, and they were saying that he changed a lot and started to, get along with his family. Everything was going good as far as like his relationship with people and with his family and everything. When he did get killed, everybody really loved him and respected him. And by the way, Keontae, the Vice Lord, said that he had been hanging out with in the documentary was not, I believe, Millard Mob. I think it was a different Vice Lord set. And whether or not he ever actually became an official member over there, I don't know. But yeah, definitely rest in peace to him. People change when they get older, man. But yeah, as far as the conflict between Millard Mob and AMG, the thing's pretty much dead. I know one guy that I've been covering involved in that went to jail. I know there were other sets of younger guys coming and taking up their hold in those neighborhoods, but yeah, it just kind of ended, man. The Millard Mob AMG thing, as far as I know, has not been continuing anywhere near what it was. I think it's pretty much died now. So we're gonna skip around here a little bit and go back to like the early 2000s, actually starting in the 90s, but then extending into like the early 2000s. There was a gang near me where I used to live on the northwest side called the Insane Popes. Okay, and they're still there. The Popes are still active. Not nearly as much as they were before, but there's still some members of theirs around. But they had a pretty hot conflict. There's actually two chapters of Popes. I should clear this up. There's Popes on the north side, and then there's Popes on the south side, and these are like really two different gangs. Okay, I think of them as the same, but it's really two different gangs, man. So at any rate, on the south side of Chicago, though, there had been a gang that was into it with the Popes called the Ridgeway Lords. The Ridgeway Lords started off the same way that the Popes started off, which was as a predominantly white gang. Now, they were in the Little Village area on the southwest side, okay, and they started all the way back in the 60s. This is before I was born. So I've just heard about it. I obviously wasn't alive to see this in real time, but they originally were getting along with Latin Kings down there, and they always accepted Hispanic members. They were white guys, but they always accepted Hispanic members, and they were into it, though they eventually got into it with the Kings, okay, their former allies, and they became part of the Folks Alliance. Now that's a whole nother thing that I'm not going to explain in this video. Technically, you could include the entire organization of the Folks Alliance and People Alliance as like certain gang wars stopping, because that did stop a lot of beef. But the Ridgeway Lords, their colors were black and blue, and they eventually joined up with the Folks, got into it with the Latin Kings. Now, what I heard was that they eventually basically got into it with everybody, and they lost their turf in Little Village, okay? And by this time, they were like predominantly Latino members, though, okay? Because like I said, they had always accepted Latinos from the beginning. So their original enemies, were the Little Village gangs. Well, after that, after they lost their turf in Little Village, they moved out to the trailer parks in the suburbs. And in particularly, I believe it was in Justice, Illinois. They moved out to like a trailer park out there. And out there, they got into it with the Popes, okay? So that war was going on for I don't know how many years, but they're beefing with the Popes, okay? And these are like two gangs that originally were white. The Popes were still white, but accepted a lot of Latinos. And the Ridgeway Lords by this time had become like predominantly Latino. Well, so how did this war end? It ended in a tragic way, because the Ridgeway Lords basically all became heavy drug addicts. They were like party animals, okay, and they got on heroin heavily. And that literally took down the gang. Started to destroy like the lives of their members. I mean really like serious dope addicts. And they eventually just fell off because of that. Like getting high on that supply took them down completely. And it ended the war. The Ridgeway Lords are now extinct. I mean, there's probably still some of them alive that are in old age, but they're not doing anything anymore. And the popes just were basically the last people standing after the drugs had completely destroyed that gang. And that's really one of the only instances of that I can see where literally drugs took them completely down. I've definitely seen it in individual cases where that drugs have done that to guys. I'm seeing it all the time, even today. I was locked up with a guy who was telling us in there, he said, I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been off those 2 pills. Like these pills, they, and some of the stuff that these guys are on today, it turns these guys into completely different people. But at any rate, yeah, that ended that war. So that's the second one. The third one, and this is one that we're going to have to go way back in the day for, all the way back to the 20s. And this is probably the biggest war to ever come to an end in Chicago, and that was Chicago Outfit versus the North Side Gang. And this is something you might have heard about in documentaries about Al Capone. So Al Capone was heading the Chicago chapter of the Italian Mafia, really separate organizations to some extent, even though they would have meetings, together with guys from other cities. But, became an extremely lucrative, powerful gang during the Roaring 20s in Chicago. And this was a time when they were deeply involved in politics, connected with police, everything, the whole bit. The money was pouring in due to prohibition of alcohol, which was creating an extremely lucrative business for organized crime. And this is something that's been documented in a lot of anything about Chicago history, really. I mean, it covers this period. But their main rivals were a gang of Irish and Polish guys on the north side of Chicago that I think had some Italians with them, and that was the North Side Gang. And if you see a gang map of the 1920s, it's basically divided between Italian and Irish all over the city. So the North Side Gang was headed by several different guys. You had Dino Banyan, you had Jaime Weiss, and then you had Bugs Moran. And they were fiercely going at it with the Chicago Outfit. They had called several truces that would last for a while and then fall apart. Al Capone, at one of the meetings at which they had called one of these truces, was complaining that the violence was getting in the way of the business. He said, and I believe this is like something like a quote of his. He said, "We're turning a great business into a shooting gallery," and this is the case with a lot of gang wars. I mean, these guys are making money hand over fist in the streets, but then the violence starts. It gets in the way of the money. And then people come along and say, well, they're committing the violence in order to get money. Well, it's the complete opposite. The violence is getting in the way of the money. This was Capone's point. So, at any rate, they called these truces, but these truces would always fall apart. And this happened several times. But then finally, what eventually took it down was that prohibition ended, okay? And the mafia, the Italians, adapted to get into other hustles that were going to keep the revenue flowing, because that was a very difficult source of revenue to replace. It was so lucrative. They were saying Al Capone was the equivalent of like a billionaire in today's money. It was really like, I can only say that it was the equivalent of like every illegal drug combined today. At least like cocaine, heroin. It was just so lucrative. Even the mayor of the city during the time, Big Bill Thompson, who I'm going to make a separate video about, was basically enabling the hustle. Okay, he had one of Capone's guys like in City Hall. Capone had a picture of him up on his wall in his office. So yeah, it was like everybody was in on this, raking in dough. And when that went away, the criminals were scrambling to find other sources of revenue. The main one that people were going to was gambling. Well, gambling got taken over when Bugs Moran was the head of the North Side Gang by something called the National Crime Syndicate, and that what they were and were doing is a whole nother video. But Bugs Moran then left the gang, so they had no big source of revenue. They didn't have gambling, they didn't have liquor anymore, and after that, the North Side Gang dissolved. So even though they had still been beefing with the Chicago Outfit, they completely went extinct, and the Chicago Outfit was left standing alone. So that the war ended. So that was how probably the biggest gang war in Chicago history ended. And as far as like race wars, because there was a big racial overtone to that, between Italian and Irish, that I consider to be, well, really any historian would have to consider that to be the biggest race war in the history of the city. The stuff between the Irish and the blacks that I had covered on cost like something like 40 lives between the two sides. I think the blacks had killed something like 17, 18 Irish. The Irish had killed like 24 black folks. That was nothing compared to the Italian and the Irish. And if anybody thinks that, well, it's all just like white on white stuff, back then people didn't look at it like that. All these different white ethnic groups looked themselves as basically different races at that particular time period. And there was a lot of racism between the two sides. And there was discrimination in jobs. I mean, that stuff was super real back then, and the racism was much more in your face than it is today. So at any rate, this next one is one that I'm probably not going to go into too much detail in this video, because I'm going to save this particular conflict for a Chicago history video episode to go into a lot of detail on it, man. But over in Inglewood, in the West Inglewood Gage Park area, back in the 1950s, there used to be a gang called the Rebels. Now, this was a white gang, okay? All white gang. And they may have had some Hispanics with them, but I'm pretty sure it was mostly white. And they had about 2,000 members, like active members in that area. We're talking Inglewood Gage Park. Now, today we think of Inglewood as like an all-black community, although there are Hispanics moving into the western part of Inglewood. But today Inglewood is a community where like no whites practically ever go unless they're doing like contract work. But back then, yeah, it was white. Inglewood was white back then. But at any rate, black folks started to move in. And this particular gang of, the Rebels was being like very hostile towards the black youth. And we're talking like kids, even younger than teenagers, like kids as young as 11, 12, 13, they were bullying them. So the black youth started to, move into like the Hyde Park, Kenwood area in greater and greater numbers. They started going to school around there, and these white gangbangers were really getting down on them, bullying them, making life miserable for these black youth. So what eventually happened was that the black youth teamed up, and like different guys from like different blocks got together, and they decided to make a organization to defend themselves against these like white gangster bullies. Okay, so they decided to try to figure out a name for their gang. They took out a Bible, and they started looking through the Bible to find like some cool words, and they came upon the word disciple, and they liked that. So they picked the word disciple, but then they wanted to make it like evil and scary, like the word. So they put the term devil in front of it, and they called themselves the Devil's Disciples. Now, other chapters of disciples started to spring up, like the East Side Disciples was a major one, and there were these various disciple gangs that started to spring up around the South Side. That eventually became like the Black Disciples, okay, and these various chapters like kind of developed separately, but also together on the South Side, and the disciple gangs eventually became like the deepest alliance on the South Side. Well, the Rebels suffered like a really humiliating incident that I'm probably going to talk about, like I said, in another video, in which at this particular time, these founding members of the disciples were not even like high school age. They were like 11 years old, 12 years old when they started this gang. And you see what it's become today, right? So yeah, they were literal kids at this time. And, they formed it to defend themselves against the white gangbangers. Well, what happened eventually, though, was that this was a time of like a lot of very in-your-face racial tension, not only in Chicago, but nationally, right? We had the civil rights movement just beginning. Things like the Emmett Till incident and things of that nature were going on. And, the KKK was doing a lot of terroristic activities. Now, there was no KKK in Chicago because the KKK actually had a conflict with the white people in Chicago due to the fact that the people here were mainly like immigrant Catholics and like Orthodox and other things, and the KKK were like fiercely Protestant, and they did not like Catholics at all. They beefed with them heavily, and the Irish here actually lynched a KKK member in effigy, basically to send them a message like, don't come here at all. So the Irish and them, they were hostile towards the blacks on their own, but they kept the Klan and them out. Uh, so it was like a different branch of like racist activity, if you can call it that. So these black guys formed the Disciples to defend against them. But when they formed that gang, as kids, the national media, and I'm not even really sure if law enforcement knew about their presence at first. Okay, the national media certainly did not seem to know, because there was an incident where some of the rebels, after they had gotten into an all-out like gang war with the BDs, killed one of the BD members, or somebody that was like friends with the BD members. I don't know if he was an actual like member back then, because again, this is like kids we're talking about. With a ball peen hammer. It was like a brutal murder. Well, the national media didn't know about the BDs at this time. So they kind of jumped to the conclusion that they had just got down on any random black kid. And so they were prosecuting it kind of like as a hate crime incident. Like they had just, picked out any black kid and just killed him just simply for being black. Not knowing about the gang conflict that, was going on between them and the BDs. Eventually the police found out about that. But, so the gang members that killed the black kid eventually did get convicted and sentenced to prison. And it, brought like a lot of law enforcement attention against the rebels, and also the ensuing war and the continued black migration to Inglewood drove a lot of the families of these guys out, because the BDs and the rebels were going back and forth, and the whites eventually moved out of Inglewood, and the gang dissolved and the war ended. But that was the Black Disciples' first ops. That was their first rivals ever. It was a white gang called the Rebels from the Inglewood Gage Park area, and that war ended really by the mid '60s. It was like completely over. Now again, I wasn't alive, but I've never seen any historical evidence that it was still going on at that point. And the new wars that the BDs got into it with were with other black gangs. And then also with what would eventually become the Gangster Disciples. Larry Hoover was the head of the High Supreme Gangsters. And, they got into it with some of the, what would eventually become the GDs. They were getting into it with all the other black gangs. There were, I think, it was either called like the Egyptian Cobras, possibly it could have been Mickey Cobras that were coming in from like the west side. They were getting into it with the what would eventually become known as the Black Pea Stones, but at that time I think they were called the Stone Raiders or the Stone Rangers. And really what drove the rebels out, again, I mean, they all moved out. Like their families just all moved out. So yeah, that's how that war ended. Now this next one is one for West Siders and North Siders mainly. If you guys remember, this was a video probably maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, where I was walking around like the near West Side, and I showed some graffiti that, I don't know how old this stuff was, man, but it was of a gang called the Insane C-Notes. And I was talking about them a little bit in that video. This is a gang that it started all the way back really in the 50s among Italian immigrants, Italian Americans. As a matter of fact, the Italian flag used to be it used to be like their symbol, but they eventually changed to like black and green. So the C-Notes used to have chapters on the west side, and chapters like around Smith Park, and they had one neighborhood over by Ohio and Levitt. And they originally were clicked up with, we're talking back in the day now, like even before I was born, with like other white gangs, as part of something called like the White Power Organization. Now this was something like from when I was like a kid and before I was born, but it was basically like all the white gangs clicking up to defend territory against like Hispanics and blacks that were moving into the area. So that, it didn't have anything to do with like the KKK or the Nazis or anything like that. But at any rate, that eventually fell apart though, and the C-Notes broke out into war with the other white gangs, namely the Gaylords mainly, from what I was told. Now again, I wasn't born, but from what I was told, like that war broke out with the Gaylords. So these white gangs, like I said, a lot of them went and got into it with each other. The C-Notes were one of the main players in that. So most of the beef, really in Chicago, is like within the same ethnicity. White gangs versus white gangs, Latino gangs versus other Latino gangs. The only real interracial conflict that I can think of that's gone on for a long time is Latin Kings and GDs. Yeah, at any rate, so they were beefing with these other white gangs, and this war was, really like it was really kind of rocking like the near West Side. Well, Puerto Rican and Hispanic immigration into that area, migration into their territory, eventually forced a lot of the C notes out, and they moved over to the Jefferson Park area on the far northwest side, over there by the transit center by the Blue Line. So they had started like chapters here and there that were kind of opening and closing, like over by Addison and Harlem, over by Franksville over there. This was like this only lasted for a little while though, okay? And so the wars with these other white gangs, this was starting to really die out because the C notes eventually, they had fallen off on the west side completely, lost all their turf. And the Jefferson Park chapter lasted for a little while. They tried to reclaim some territory over by Ohio and Leavitt by accepting a lot of Hispanic members. But that gang really now is pretty much a dead gang. You'll still find some old timers that will claim it here and there, but their war with the Gaylords really ended. I mean, that war is done. Like, again, there's old school Gaylords that'll claim that, and there's old school C notes that'll claim that. But as far as like a war, guys just got old. Simple as that. And that's how that war ended. And this was like, a terrible war, like in the white communities, in the Italian communities, European immigrant communities on the northwest side. Guys just got old, period. And the war ended. And also, like I said, Latino immigration took away their territory. And even though they started accepting some Hispanic members, it just fell off, And so by really, I would say definitely by 2000, it was like completely over. So yeah, that war ended like that. So you can see how sad it is because so many people lost their lives, got incarcerated for life in the midst of these wars, and now they're all done. And this is just the beginning. This is the tip of the iceberg of a list that I could make. I could make a video about gang wars that ended in Chicago. They could go on for hours and hours. I might make a sequel to this video where I document a few more. But these guys now, they see like their old ops. They shake hands. They, go out to lunch together. And it's like, we're just past that stage of life. And man, I wish I could just take that perspective like out of their brains, out of the old guys' brains, and put it into these young guys' brains. I really do, man. It's just so sad watching them, beef with each other and kill each other over something that they're not going to still be on, 30, 40 years from now. But that's the way it goes, man. Kids are going to be kids, and unfortunately, these kids get a hold of guns and start whacking each other off. What's really unfortunate is a lot of them have kids themselves before they get whacked, and then those kids are growing up with no parents. It's just a sad situation all around. So rest in peace to everybody that lost their life, and shout out to everybody who's squashed all these beefs. And one thing that I should mention, the squashing of beefs, a lot of times it gets complicated in Chicago because when you call it truce, these gangs sometimes are clicked up with other sets. Sets are clicked up with one another. Now with some of the Hispanic gangs where it's like a citywide, or some of the white gangs where it's like a citywide organization, if there's a truce, it might turn out to be like a citywide truce. That is not the case 100% anymore with some of the Hispanic gangs, though, because they're kind of breaking off into sets too. But especially with the black gangs and with some of the Hispanic gangs now, they're just these neighborhood sets. They form these alliances with other neighborhoods, and sometimes when one of those sets calls a truce with one of their ops, the other neighborhoods aren't on board with that. And when they call a truce with guys that were just blowing it, they're basically their allies against that gang. Those guys start to, look at that as like, now they're a threat. And then it starts up a new war. And that was never even the way it was supposed to be. So squashing one beef often starts up another beef. I've seen this happen, unfortunately, in recent years, which is messed up because then the older guys can see that and like, well, is it worth it to call this truce because it might start up a new war? It's very complicated, man. I wish everybody would get on that, on the same page these older guys are on, man, because, especially with these young kids to see, like, God got a bigger plan for their life, period. Way bigger than this stuff. So, at any rate, everybody needs to report. I'm out.